Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, is Moldbug right about his super Protestantism / ultracalvinism theory? Now, this theory purports to explain how we have come to have the ruling orthodoxy that has sort of sprouted up from effectively the late 19th century onwards. Tim, can you fill us in on the details?
So I first read Moldbug or Curtis Yarvin a while back, and he's one of the authors I think that I would call as a Quake author, in the sense that he in some ways changed my thinking since the point. Now, his theory is not. He has two things I learned from his. He's the first person to have like an anti-democratic theory that I read, like someone who actually tries to take on democracy. Hans Hoppe would be the other one. But Moldbug's primary contribution to me is highlighting how that Protestants, in particular certain types of Protestants, have created the modern world, the order, the ruling elite order currently. And I'd say they've been in charge since 1914, and in certain societies they've been in charge probably since the 1600s. And I think you can draw a fairly direct line. Now, before I get into the theory itself, I want to say that for all social theories, no social theory explains all the facts 100% correct. And the problem, so then you're left with the problem of, well, why theorize at all? Well, I'd say you have to sort of theorize to do any sort of analysis. You can't just use this kaleidoscope of historical facts and movements and figures. I would say to do any sort of analysis, you have to do some sort of theory behind to organize the information. I'd say Moldbug organizes the information well enough, or actually quite well. And I think the competing arguments against it in general don't work as well as people think they do. So first of all, what exactly is it? What exactly is Moldbug's super Protestant theory? Well, first of all, Moldbug brings up an old article from a Time magazine, and it's quite interesting. It quotes these super Protestants, and these super Protestants want to create this sort of new world order, like with a managed society, and a world government of delegated powers, complete abandonment of U.S. isolationism, strong immediate limitations on sovereignty, international control of all armies and navies, a universal system of money, and they do this all under the aegis of super Protestants. These are the high spots of organized U.S. Protestant, super Protestant new program for a just and durable peace after World War II. And then this didn't come out of nowhere. I mean, this sort of movement after 1945 didn't come out of nowhere. And Moldbug, to me, correctly states the historical record of how we got there. How did we get there? Well, he roots it in beginnings in Christian Protestantism, and I think he's correct. He starts with like the Geneva Protestants, then it goes to into Germany, and then eventually England, and eventually Massachusetts. Now, in some ways, his theory is very praiseworthy of the sort of ultra-Calvinism. And the term ultra-Calvinism, he says, is just a way to describe it. I do think they're all sort of heirs to John Calvin. Now, people think, how could you say that feminists are heirs to Calvinism? Well, I think they are. I think they are. I think that's not a reach to say. Now, John Calvin himself wouldn't do it, but this is how social change happens. I mean, this is how social change happens. It's in a line. I mean, that's part of the theorists themselves. They say it's a theory of progress. And so for a theory to get to a managed society, I think some examples of super Protestants or historical or ultra-Calvinists are, I made a list of them. I think Oliver Cromwell, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine. More later day ones, of course, are Woodrow Wilson, John Dewey, and more back to the historical ones, Hegel and Kant. All of these people come from Protestant Christian societies. Kant comes from up there in Königsberg, with the more Protestant parts, from my understanding, of Germany. Same way, Engels comes from a Calvinist family. Thomas Paine and Jefferson both have very super Protestant-y worldviews. Now, they're deists, but nonetheless, Jefferson has this sort of this idea of splitting the Red Sea. He has his expansionist empire. Jefferson is not an Anabaptist by no means. By no means. In the same way with Oliver Cromwell. I mean, as Peter Hitchens would say, the current incarnations of them are the most intolerant regime since Oliver Cromwell. So again, there are slightly different incarnations, and I would say it's the Dutch, the Americans, and the British, certain parts of them, and almost all social movements owe their lineage to these groups. Take feminism. In the United States and Britain, both the first groups that really put women in the pulpits were Quakers. And there's a direct line from Protestantism to Quakerism. The Low Church movement in Britain, as Moldbug cites, has always been more Calvinistic than the High Anglicans. And in the United States has been, since its founding, has always had a strong influence in Calvinism. I mean, this is the same as Massachusetts, the founder of Rhode Island, founder of Massachusetts. And where do all these universities come from? Same thing. So the fact that Harvard creates elites that have this idea, to me, is not a stretch. As Moldbug brings up, what the counterexamples are saying is that somehow that France, this is the example he makes his criticism. He said, look, think of France. It'd be like saying that at some point, we had old France and new France. Old France believed one thing, but then other people saying suddenly they died out and they got switched, and New France now has an entirely different belief system. No, the belief system is in a lineage. It's the same thing. Now, and I think this counters a lot of conservatives, and I think Michael Malice is dead on this, is because most normie conservatives are whole cloth part of the movement that the ruling elites have. They just take 20 years longer. I mean, the Protestants that now accept. I mean, some of the conservative churches accept gay marriage a lot harder than the liberal churches did 20 years ago, significantly more so. And same way on like anti-racism and those things. But back to the issue of feminism. It was the suffragettes. Suffragettes, clear Christian lineage. Those are the broad formations in that did it. It did not come from Africa. It did not come from Asia. The modern day feminist movement owes its lineage to Protestantism and Quakerism, for better or for worse. Again, this is actually praiseworthy if you like the theory and you like Christianity. It's actually praiseworthy, so forth. I mean, these are Methodists, these are Lutherans, and all sorts of groups. Now you could accuse this of being overly broad, and I think that criticism is warranted. But if you look at Woodrow Wilson, and Rothbard has a great article about how Woodrow Wilson is like the zenith of the American progressive movements. Now Gary North has a great critique of this as well, but I'd say Gary North's critique fails to really demonstrate. He just carves off a small group that didn't go along with it. I mean, okay, there's a small group of people that didn't go along with it. I mean, so what? There's small groups of anti-Stalinists in Stalinist Russia, but that doesn't discount the fact that most of them went with the Stalinists. I mean, I think the same thing goes with the Wilsonians and so forth. So to me, and I could quote from the Rothbard article directly if I wanted to, but this is where they got the Prohibition movement. This is where they got and the Prohibition movement got the Civil Rights movement right after, the New Deals, the Three New Deals, a great book by that name as well. So I'd say, and there's slight differentiations. I think Britain is the older, but I'd say it has all the same tendencies, and there's slightly different names they fly under, but they have all the same tendencies. And they have all the same tendencies. Actually, the American occupation of Germany, the only legitimate competitor to this ruling elites, is a very close thing. And outside of the lunatic cult known as the Third Reich, Germany has all the same attributes. And in some ways today, is even more politically correct, more multicultural than the United States or Britain is. And those are the societies that rule the world. It's not, and actually the Soviet Union was largely funded by the British and the United States. It was an agrarian society. All the intellectual ideas were imported from like Trier, Germany. Where was Marx from? Highly Protestant society. He himself was a Jew, but he's living in a highly Protestant society. He did not come from Lebanon, or South, or like Nigeria, or Mayan, or Incas. All the major ideologies do not come from like conservatives had this idea that was tainted from the outside. No, most of the modern social movements come within Christianity. They owe their heirs. Now, again, they might be apostate or pious, or they might not have all the attributes. But I would say that broadly, Moldbug's theory is correct. Again, as I stated, social theories, they're nothing perfect. So Swithin, so far, what do you make of my characterization here? Do you think it's overly broad and imprecise? I think there's some ancillary points that support it. I mean, Rothbard basically buys into this sort of broad tenets of the theory. And then I know you can always carve out, well, this obscure kaleidoscope group didn't do it. But I think we get the David Friedman problem of history, where you could just say, well, it's not theorized at all. But I'd say as a social theory, in general, those are the groups that rule the world. And today, I mean, it's like the Blairites and Hillary Clintonites that are the ascendant people, the neocons, and those are the ascendant people. And they affect both left and right political parties. In some ways, they're all heirs. And I also don't think that feminism came from the Incas. Feminism did not come from the Africa. Feminism, as constructed in the United States, came from Quakerism plus Christianity. Now, people say, well, Paul, he's a patriarch. There's actually a book, Patriarch of Feminists. You can make both competing arguments. I would say in general that, in the same way with anti-slavery movement, almost all societies had anti-slavery. And one of the movements of World War I for Woodrow Wilson was to make the world safe for democracy. And since undemocratic societies are kind of slave society, that's why the United States and Britain has to go invade everywhere else to set up democracy. And people like modern day inhabitants of this theory, like Christopher Hitchens, who was also a Marxist earlier in the days, he went to a Marxist to a neocon, I'd say perfectly embodied that as well. So Swithin, overall, what do you in general make of it and his theory? Swithin?
There's a lot to go at here. The first thing I would say is I think Moldbug is right with respect to Christianity in general, before we hit to the Calvinism part, that Christianity does raise, in general, the status of women relative to other cultures and have existed historically, and also children for that matter. For example, they're against infanticide, etc., which is common in the classical world. That is certainly true. And also the point that Christianity is a universal religion, in a sense, and that all individuals are capable of salvation, and one should evangelize them. And so I think that is as it were, a necessary component to the current sort of progressive approach to things. That treats everybody like they need to reform bad think from people, and so it follows sort of a similar trajectory. I think that makes sense. What I would say with respect to feminism and all of the movements you point out, I think it's given the fact that the West has become sort of globally hegemonic due to its economic development relative to the rest of the world. It was kind of inevitable that whatever ruling orthodoxy came into existence would grow out of Christianity, because Christianity was basically ubiquitous in those areas. The question arises, are the conclusions that have sort of like been drawn from the progressives, the totalitarian humanists, or whatever you wish to call them, are they a necessary conclusion or sort of a contingent one? And I think that's where I think most of my criticism would come in. So, for example, yes, it is true that the modern form of feminism does seem to grow out of, to some extent, a Christian understanding of things. However, if you take J.D. Unwin's analysis seriously, there seems to be sort of whether you would call them feminist movements as such, there were certainly movements which rose the legal status of women and their kind of influence in society overall to something similar to modern feminism. That said, they didn't become careerist women, although that's probably only really possible because of the pill more than anything else. There's a paper by George Akerlof which treats the pill as a technology shock, with Janet Yellen, actually, because they're married from memory. But there are sort of proto-feminism, you could call it, which precedes Christianity. So as I said, J.D. Unwin points this out in Greece. That took place. I think one of the interesting anecdotes, Solon apparently limited the amount that aristocratic wives could spend because they're basically spending too much money and had sort of like too much influence, which indicates at least there was a relatively higher status. And I've heard similar arguments of the status of women actually in the 1st century AD in the Roman Empire. But I would say as modern feminism goes, yes, it will be drawn out of a sort of a higher status of a higher view of women in general, which is a part of Christianity, but I don't think it's exactly exclusive to it. So that's sort of feminism in general. If I then hit now sort of Calvinism. So Calvinism is interesting in comparison to, or Protestantism in general in comparison to the Roman Catholic Church, because you do get the idea to some extent the Roman Catholics are somewhat more lax in their sort of personal morality, you could say, than are the Protestants, or at least that's how it was characterized to some extent, at least in the Reformation period. And the difference in approach in general can be seen to some extent by, if you look at Thomas Aquinas, I think he made the argument that whilst it was immoral, it was probably a good idea to keep prostitution legal, which is not something that you would typically associate with a more Protestant Calvinistic view, where there is a very strong emphasis on sort of rigorous personal behavior. And to some extent, you could say it was perfectionistic, which I think is probably the key part here. That, and this is where you had sort of like the cities on a hill with the emigrants to America, is we'll create this sort of Christian society where everybody will have display rigorous Christian virtue, etc. And I think that to some extent is the impetus for sort of attempting to improve all individuals to a large extent. And it's not just an elite class that can do it. Everybody can do it, but they must just be enlightened by a certain class to do it. Now, that said, if this was just to take on sort of Orthodox Christian theology, then this wouldn't be about public schools, healthcare, transport infrastructure, bringing peace to the whole world, etc. It would have been you individually sorting yourself out, maybe via the church, but not via the state. That change, which Moldbug points out rightly, is the influence of the Unitarian Universalists, who are non-Trinitarians, Universalists in the sense that, well, ultimately, not just everybody can be saved, but everybody is saved. And then they merge with sort of the liberal social gospel post-millennialists. The post-millennialists believing that Christ would return after the millennium. In this context, the millennium being sort of like the paradise on earth, I suppose is a possibly unfair way of describing it, but a golden era after which Christ would return. And this would be then inaugurated by social work. And that's different from, say, the Cromwellian position of the Orthodox Calvinist one, which was basically going to be brought out by evangelism. That is, well, the whole world would just become Christian, and then we'd inaugurate the millennium. Whereas in the social gospel movement, it's, well, we'll kind of Christianize the world, not by evangelism, but by giving people free housing and things like that. And Gary North himself actually points out that really is the genesis of the current orthodoxy, that kind of mid-19th century position. Although what I would say is, and then Moldbug points out, it kind of isn't Christian to a large extent, at least not historically. I mean, feminism only really rises in the West, particularly when Christianity is losing its influence. And it is to some extent losing its influence, especially in the upper classes in the late 19th century, and certainly by the early 20th. I mean, large amounts of atheism and socialism are a good example. George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, for example. So I think Christianity is declining in its sort of influence, at least orthodoxly, theologically speaking, from at least the mid to late 19th century anyway. I wouldn't say it's orthodoxly Christian. And then Moldbug said this is actually to its benefit because it doesn't look like it's a theology. And this is where he says it's particularly helpful in the United States because there's the official separation of church and state. And so by avoiding the orthodoxy looking like a religion means it can actually spread more widely than it otherwise would be, because no one can claim, oh, you're trying to impose a theocracy on us. The state, you're supposed to have separation of church and state, and they say, well, it's not theology, so one can't impose a theocracy. So those would be my sort of broad views on the Moldbugian theory here.
Great. I want to continue with Jefferson here, and I think Jefferson, at least for the United States context, and I think you could put this back to the English Civil War as well. I think there's similar events. The American Revolution and the English Civil War have similar events, and I'd say that functionally both the non-royalist position in both conflicts were I wouldn't say pseudo-Marxist. I'd say they are the heirs to Marx. I think Thomas More has a statue in the Wall of Fame I'm not sure exactly what they call it in the Soviet Union. And I think the Diggers and those groups in the I think that was the English Civil War. I think they're all sort of air quote left wing, for better or worse. And again, they're definitely left wing for their time. But in some ways, Jefferson still remains left wing for our time, for example. Jefferson's not some minor political figure in American history. He's like a significant author of the key founding documents, significant actor. And he writes a letter, the famous Adam and Eve letter, which is a Jacobin letter. I mean, this is not a minor. This is a two-term president who has, this is a two-term president. Now, of course, Jefferson owned slaves, blah, 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 blah. That can easily be, you can either say, well, that's just part of, his, you can say, well, he's working to get rid of them. That can be pushed aside. And Christopher Hitchens adores Jefferson, for example. Christopher Hitchens, a modern figure, adores Jefferson. But I would say that in Sean Galvin's lecture on the American Revolution, again, I'm not entirely sure if he thinks the American revolutions are a slaveholders' rebellion, a la 1619, or a Marxist rebellion. And I think both, there are slaveholder Marxists in a way, but I think with Thomas Paine, Patrick Henry, Jefferson, as well as some of the characters that show up in the English Civil War, it's not unclear that there isn't, the American Revolution does have a lot in common with the French Revolution. And once a revolution happens in a way they won the war on ideas. And once you win the war on ideas, especially in a society that has a high literacy culture, it's basically game over for the other side. It's just basically a surrender match. I think one of the reasons why a lot of conservatives don't like the theory is that they themselves are unable to stop the social change because they are a part of it. And this is where Michael Malice comes up with the phrase that conservatives are just progressives going the speed limit. And I think that's entirely true. I think, yesterday's liberals are today's conservatives. And I think that's literally true here in Britain and the United States. In Dave Rubin, for example, I think Moldbug doesn't have a solution, nor do I have a solution. But I think he's provides a correct diagnostic of the key events and what exactly motivates them. For example, the United States still engages in imperialism. But interestingly, when I was in college, there was a low-level Clinton administration staffer that gave a talk in one that I had to go there because my class was there. And that was when I cared about education more. And interestingly, United States aid to Kenya, she worked in Kenya, for example, is dependent on Kenya having 50% women in their police departments. I I mean, this is from a staffer, so I'm just going to take to what she said as truth. So apparently, that's like a direct, the only examples of imperialism that exist today are done on the grounds of feminism. So apparently, there's one reason why major cities in Kenya have women police officers is because that's how they get the money. That's one of the requirements for the American aid money. I just find this fact hilarious, and that fact can be to me only explained understanding that theory. Interestingly, when this theory gets exported outside of the United States, Britain, and Germany, I'd say it's the three origin sites in Geneva as well. Interestingly, when it gets exported out, it sometimes can just kill societies entirely. It probably nearly killed Russia. Because you got to remember, Marxism, and the more I read about it, the more I understand that Marxism did not originate in Russia, per se. I mean, Marx spoke German. He was from Trier. Same with Engels. Same way with the predecessors to the Hegel, Kant. When these ideas migrate outside of the original areas, they sometimes can just kill societies outright. When these sort of ideas, I mean, United States, Britain, Germany, there are very high-functioning societies, extremely high-functioning societies, and actually, which is why they could export them. Now, go to Neil Ferguson style. Is this theory a killer app? I'm not entirely sure. It could be actually a weakening at this point. So when the theory gets exported elsewhere, and this is interesting, it sometimes can just kill societies outright. Interestingly, when Western ideas gets imported to other societies, and again, like I said, the more I learn about the history of Marxism, the more I think it's quintessentially Anglo-British German idea. It did not come from societies out there. The roots are within them. Now, again, that's an unpopular thesis for some conservative Christians who view themselves as anti-Marxists. But when the Moldbug states communism is American as apple pie, and I think that's largely correct per se. And actually, as Marx himself advised Lincoln during the Civil War, he was sending letters to him. So the idea that and actually, I think I thought that if America adopted it would be a super state. If America adopted the ideas of it, and I actually think America would have pulled it off better than the Soviet Union would have pulled it off. And so forth. So when ideas get exported elsewhere, they have terrible consequences. Like take China. China today got Western ideas via Marxism, mainly. It was a pre-industrial society, just like Russia was. And I think its fertility rate in places like Taiwan, fertility rates below 1. So in some ways, these ideas can just kill societies outright. It'd be interesting to see what it will do to the Ottoman Empire, which is now Turkey as well as Iran. It'd be interesting to see if they adopt Western ideas. And I think one of the ancillary positions that Keith Press a while back had a posting from a Native American. He said that Marxism is alien to me as Christianity. And I say that, and Moldbug brings up, is Christianity a subset of Marxism, or is Marxism a subset of Christianity? I think that's a close relationship between the two. So yeah, I mean, when the Marxists treated the indigenous ways the same way Jefferson would have treated the indigenous people, they're backward and they need to be raised up or eliminated. One of the two positions. Or they just view them as cattle, which is just the sort of race realist position. And of course, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Marx were all race realists, and sort of Woodrow Wilson. So, what's your view on the exportation of ideas, as well as what's your view on the American Civil War and the English Civil War, as well as the American Revolution regarding this theory? Do all the winners, air quote, were left wing? Do you think that's a true statement, Swithin?
Well, I suppose it begs the question of what's left wing. I seem to remember Keith Preston makes the argument that anybody after John Locke is left wing in a certain sense. If you're going to take the idea of right wingism in its sort of classic form of being the Indian caste system, which is probably a reasonable way of doing it. But you don't think you need to go quite that far. I think it's certainly true that some of the radicals of the 17th century. They take a blank slate position of humanity, and I think that's one of the key points. because that means that people are then malleable and then can be sort of changed. I think that is the case, and also related to that is the view on history and tradition, and so a lot of the revolutionaries would have had the idea that we can start from year zero, which I suppose is somewhat similar to Pol Pot in Cambodia. That said, I don't think everybody involved in the English Civil War who was against the monarchy were necessarily held that view, although I don't have a hugely exhaustive knowledge of the English Civil War, so I wouldn't really want to comment on the particular circumstances there. But certainly those of sort of the Enlightenment who thought that we could create societies based on sort of reason and throwing off the shackles of the past, that certainly is consistent with modern progressivism. That is certainly true. When it comes to whether Marxism is Christian, I think it's pretty fair to say that Marxism is a Christian heresy. I think that's probably fair. And you are right. It is very much a sort of Marxism is very much a chauvinist view of things, in that we should have progress, and if you don't have progress, then you are backwards, and therefore you need lifting up. I think that's definitely the case. Again, the question with, let's say, the super Protestant theory is whether it's necessarily Protestant, and whether you could have had those revolutions, as it were, without having such a view of things. Although, I mean, you could really just treat, say, the English Civil War as primarily a power play. Is the aristocracy were becoming less powerful. Although, actually, no, to be fair, it was probably not the aristocracy. It's more the upper middle class business, mercantile individuals who saw the king as their sort of enemy primarily, and then they used the idea of we need to have quasi-democracy and limited government. That comes from, say, the late 17th century and the Glorious Revolution, which John Locke basically creates an apology for on his treaties of government. So, I mean, you get into the question here is, do they rebel on sort of ideological grounds, or is it more on, as it were, class interest, just materially speaking? Because it did seem to be the case, say, with what's an interesting thing is it's, from what I understand, the centralization of power in England to the king basically took place because the king tried to enrich people other than the traditional aristocracy to increase his own power at their expense. But eventually they came back to bite him in 200 years or so later. But as to whether, as I say, the revolutionary was necessarily, quote unquote, left wing per se, it certainly seems to have had that effect. But as I say, whether that was necessary or not is another question. That's, as I say, I think that's my broad view.
What do you make of the exportation of these ideas elsewhere? Again, I think, and what do you make of my comments about conservatism's disliking Rothbard, as well as Moldbug's characterization that it's a... Now again, Rothbard in a way as a libertarian in the way is somewhat part of it too. Somewhat part of it too in a way, and that's one of the conservative criticisms that Rothbard, as well as libertarians broadly, will get it as well. But that, as I say, you can just turn around and throw it back at them making it too. So in some ways they're both drawing from the same well. They're both drawing the same well of ideas and social factors. And again, I mean, one of the ways that Rothbard was a new left person early on, and quite fierce new left person from my understanding. Although I'm not entirely sure about that. That's one of the things that people might dispute over. But nonetheless, I would say that the characterization of the ideas, I'd say, are broadly correct in that conservatives are part of that they're only going the speed limit, so to speak, on these issues. I mean, take the U.S. Civil War. Jaffa supports the U.S. Civil War more than most people, and Jaffa's like a neocon in the United States. Jaffa's from the right. I mean, some of the biggest defenders of the Civil War are on the right, for example. They're not on the left anymore, and actually, the left has a sort of strange view on the American Civil War, as pointed out by Christopher Hitchens. They can't really exactly make up their mind. Although if you ask them, they will clearly not be in support of Robert E. Lee, for one thing. We can tell that. Whether or not they support Lincoln is of some question, but they're clearly not. And in the same way with World War I, they don't like American isolationism. And that actually shows up in the dislike of Ron Paul and Noam Chomsky's dislike of Ron Paul as well. They do not like American isolationism at all. So even for all of Woodrow Wilson's, for example, air quote racism or whatever, which is another thing. Again, modern day conservatives, the first thing they bring up about Woodrow Wilson is the fact he resegregated the military, but nonetheless, in general, because they are a part of it, a substantial, like, total critique of them is a bit hard to take. Because there are internationalists, there are universalists, and so forth. And then, speaking of internationalism, go back to my earlier question: what do you make of the exportation of these ideas elsewhere in their trajectory? I mean, the societies I think it will kill off certain societies, ironically. And again, as I pointed out with my example with Kenya, as I pointed out with China, China's got the Maoist famine was the Civil War was an incredibly brutal period in Chinese history, where they got Western ideas basically shocked into them, and then Chinese industrialization is the same way. But back to the theory, so A, what do you make of the conservative dislike of the theory, and B, what do you make of it getting exported elsewhere? Swithin?
I would say with the theory kills. I think, as it were, bad ideas always do. When it comes to population of various countries, you mentioned Taiwan, I think you have to take into account technological changes with that. As I mentioned, the pill before. Without that, you're not going to have such astonishingly low birth rates. I just think that's just basically impossible. I suppose you could create some other equally good contraceptive method, but in the absence of that, you're going to have reasonably high birth rates. Maybe not 7 total fertility rate, which I think is Niger currently, but you're not going to be below 1. I think that's certainly true. When it comes to sort of communism and stuff going to sort of China, etc., really what did it in for the Russians and the Chinese was basically they just tried to industrialize society at such a rapid rate that the preconditions for that taking place simply weren't there. And so you created famines, etc., because society wasn't really ready for it. And so I suppose you could say on the sort of progressive view, well, they were doing the right thing, they just went a bit too fast. On to the conservatives. I think what explains the conservatives is that they are conservatives with a small c, and basically which I mean they kind of remember the past, their own past, as being sort of slightly better than it was today, and so they just sort of believe what was then there was right. And then, when you get replaced by younger conservatives, well, then that thing just changes because they have very little rigorous theoretical positions to take. The Buckleyite conservatism, say the 50s, again, just defined itself on what it was against. It was just against communism because communism was bad. And basically all it ended up doing was defending the military-industrial complex and allowed anything else to take place. Also, one of the problem with the conservative movement in general is that they, because basically the media newspapers, etc., have been leftist from, well, at least start, and the universities from the start of the 20th century, basically, if not earlier. Obviously, so I mean, you can make the argument from Moldbug or you that they always were leftists in certain respects. They want to be considered part of the cool crowd, and so they can't have opinions which are too far away from what is considered acceptable. And so, they just have this slightly unacceptable position, but only marginally. And then, so whenever the media and the culture change, well, they'll change too, and then they'll say be running at the speed limit, as Michael Malice pointed out. But I think this is primarily rooted in the conservatism, and I think if I'm being fair to them, the best form of them at least is to say that, well, we are anti-theoreticians. We want to be practical and pragmatic, and I think this particularly sells well to some extent in America. America sees itself as a pragmatic nation, getting stuff done, not like the French, for example, who have well, maybe they do, but I get the impression, at least in France, that they like themselves as an intellectual people rather than the practical people.
Yeah, great. That answers that. I think some fairness to warrant to them is important, but I don't think William Buckley actually legitimately thought or wanted any actual change on any, which again, I'm somewhat ignorant. To the extent I can be, I'm not an activist, and that's one of the things one of the things I like about Moldbug. I actually have a lot of similar social factors in a way to him, which is one of the reasons why I probably like reading him. I mean, when I read it, I thought it was patently obvious, but then when I realized many conservatives do not like this kind of theory, I was sort of somewhat befuddled by this, because I thought it was obvious. This clearly fits my personal experience as well as historical experiences pointed out by Rothbard as well. Of course, you could call out certain groups that didn't fall away, so to speak, of course, but I say the general thrust of the theory is broadly correct. Again, there might be some epicircles, but I don't think there's enough epicircles to say it's totally false. Make enough epicircles to make it totally false. I don't want to hammer away that point too much, but I don't think, for example, John McCain or Tony Blair, I mean, if you lined up John McCain, Tony Blair with Barack Obama, okay, you ask them what do they actually disagree about, you're picking hairs to me. You're picking hairs, and even William F. Buckley back then. I mean, did he actually? What exactly did he conserve? Did he actually want to conserve anything? And I just don't. I think that's largely false. Maybe they're anti-theoreticians. I mean, that's probably the most terrible explanations for them. That's probably the most terrible explanations for them. But their hostility toward this, I think, is rather alarming if they really and pertinent to in favor of the theory. But moving on to my final few points here. One of the points that Keith Preston brought up when he was reading it, and again, I don't think Moldbug is original, is that when Keith Preston praised Hans Hoppe, but he later learned that Hans Hoppe got his work from the old European right. He said that the critique of democracy was actually not really original to Hoppe. It was an idea that came out there, and I think the same way, Moldbug is just drawing from Rothbard. And speaking of the conservative movement in general, what do you think of the general trajectory of being against democracy or being against and Protestantism in general in the Anglo-American world in general with it? I mean, this shows up in problems in the libertarian movement as well. You get the sort of thick-thin dispute. And I think that part of the thick-thin dispute, I would argue, is over culture, which is related to very much to democracy and the influence of democracy. I mean, that's at the end of the day, that's what gets Hans Hoppe in trouble. That's what gets Hans Hoppe in trouble with the more liberal members of the party, of the not the Libertarian Party, small p. And going back to our Sean Gabb episode, I would argue U.S. and Britain and this is part of the Moldbug theory. U.S. and Britain have a very similar intellectual heritage and people heritage too, for the most part, especially early on. Jefferson knew English history very well. So did Washington. These people they did not consider themselves German or Irish. They considered themselves English. Well, Jefferson, I'm not precisely sure, but they have a similar intellectual heritage. But what do you think overall in the Anglo-American world about anti-democratic thought in the trajectory of it? Do you think Moldbug is part of that, or at least as a diagnosis, or as Hayek would say, a secondhand a carrier of ideas and so forth? Swithin?
I'm not sure. I think Moldbug doesn't seem to be original. Moldbug seems to praise primarily Mosca, who is an Italian theorist who James Burnham writes quite a bit about in his book he wrote after the managerial revolution called Machiavellians. So that basic theory of that is there is always a party that is ruling, and in Mosca's view that we just should be clear as to who it is who is ruling, because when you have a position where someone looks like they're in power but they aren't, then you don't get responsibility for the power which is exercised. That was basically Mosca's view, and that's essentially what Moldbug's view is, at least from an interview I listened to him relatively recently. So what will happen to the anti-democratic related to that is the point is I think Moldbug makes and Mosca is democracy to a large extent you could claim never really existed. In sort of Athenian times, there's only the citizens who could vote, who are a very small proportion of the population. They could only devote their time to politics because you had a massive slave class who did all the work for them. So they had time to engage in politics, as it were. And so the Moldbugian and the European New Right theory tends to be, I think, that there is always a small group who rule, and it's a question of how they rule. And actually, democracy, to a large extent, in most times and places, has always been just a smokes and mirrors exercise, which is anathema to those who see it as progress. Now, how this will happen in the future, well, I think we're coming to quote-unquote a crisis. I don't like to call it a crisis as such, but I think it's becoming increasingly clear that there is no genuine choice amongst any political parties. The permanent government bureaucracies have their ideas and they just roll on whoever is in power. I mean, this is, if you're going to be favourable to Donald Trump, is you could say, well, he attempted to do lots of things and he was just stopped from doing so. Whether that's true or not is another question. But this sort of current orthodoxy of things is guides those who have the actual material power in the media, the permanent government bureaucracies, the military industrial complex, and the banking sector. And pretty much if you got those sewn up, that's going to stay there for a while. But I think as the lockdowns have shown, Brexit-related things, that I think we'll get to a situation where there is an increasing disaffection with the democratic system, and that nothing really can genuinely be changed, and actually really it's a smokes and mirrors job of the ruling oligarchy. That said, if I were in the ruling elite at present, I would be noticing this and I would attempt to shake it up. So in the UK context, that would be something like bringing in proportional representation rather than first past the post. So then, at least in principle, you could vote for whichever party you wanted to. You wouldn't just go for the least worst option. Let's vote for the Tories so Labour don't get in. You could vote for I don't know, the National Anarchist Party or something along those lines, because it wouldn't be a wasted vote because all parties would get seats as a proportion of the amount of things that they were voted for. So that's a possibility. But I do think we've seen the heyday of democracy, at least in the West, at least in the way it's Not its theory as such necessarily. I think its theory is probably stronger than ever, but in practice, the practice belief in my vote counts, I can make a difference, I think is going to get smaller and smaller over time.
I would agree. I mean, one of the things that Peter Hitchens has is he just basically wants to write an obituary for the United States. Someone asked him, why doesn't he run for political parties? And he said that, well, he just a waste of time. And it has a book called The Dave Cameron Delusion. And I think I haven't read it, but I've read some of his blog posts about it. And I think his argument is entirely correct. And I think equally right, the George Bush Delusion. It would be an equally good title. Now, again, one thing you could do is you just say one thing, and this, I think, an honest conservative movement that would actually knew what its position would say is that, in time we will support everything that the far left supports, just given time. That would be an honest position to hold. And actually, arguably, the libertarians that disliked by the Hoppians are closer to it, what the conservative movement actually ends up being, with the conservative most in broad tendencies. I mean, if you really sat Joe Jorgensen down with the guy who founded William Buckley, I mean, again, do they actually, what would they disagree about? I mean, there might be some minor differences, but it's to me the significance of Moldbug, as well as the Italian theorist you brought up, as well as James Burnham, is to highlight who's in charge and what ideas are motivating them, and sort of cut away the sort of sillier, less plausible theories. And again, I think there are some clear reasons why certain aspects of them will be unpopular to certain groups. So those are in general my final comments regarding him. Do you have any final comments to add about the Dave Cameron George Bush delusion and just writing an obituary? I most people vote for the worst candidate in the United States. I think it's roughly the same thing. I think conservatives in Britain have to be very much annoyed at Boris Johnson. I mean, he hasn't, from my understanding, he hasn't even left the European Union. He's handled one of the most bizarre coronavirus policies I've seen. So I have very little hope. I mean, Trump didn't do much either. So I think that's the significance. So any comments on that, and then we'll wrap this up and finish it. Swithin?
On Boris Johnson, the UK, technically speaking, left the EU last year. I think. Oh no, it was the start of. I think it's just. Yeah. I can't remember the exact date. But basically, we haven't left yet in practice. Although there's a new trade agreement that comes into force effectively on the 1st of January, which has well, I haven't read it because it's over 1,200 pages long. But it has got, interesting, some warm reception in sort of the anti-EU camps. Although I'm somewhat dubious of it because it seems to basically keep everything the same as it is at present to a large extent. Because if the UK diverges from EU rules in certain ways, they're just going to put tariffs on us. And it's just like, well, this just seems to be creating inertia to say, well, before we couldn't change the laws because the EU laws said we couldn't do it. But now we can't do it because it'll just mess up the economy if we do. So I'm dubious of it, but I think it's a good PR coup for him, given the way it has gone. But I agree with you with the Dave Cameron delusion and George Bush one. I think both of them are. Well, Cameron less so, but George Bush was very much the conservative going at the speed limit. Cameron very much tried to remodel himself on Tony Blair as a sort of progressive, compassionate conservatism, which I've never really knew what that meant. I think it basically meant social liberalism with slightly less taxation and regulation than Tony Blair, but apart from that, it was basically the same. So that's how it's pretty much gone. I mean, as I say, it would be interesting to see how they try to reinvigorate the democracy as the ruling ideology. Although, to be fair, here, what it's time to be turned into now rather than democracy is the cult of the NHS. The government has now declared that they want to ban the sale of sugary foods from shopping tills because they encourage impulse purchase and make people fat. And this is all tied in with the cult of the NHS. So I suppose we could be moving away from democracy to maintaining the cult of the NHS, which is one reason why you don't want socialized medicine in the US. Otherwise, it becomes a sacred cow, as it does here. But with Moldbug's theory overall, I think it is broadly accurate, although I would emphasize the fact that it's become successful from the mid to late 19th century onwards when it got rid of most of its historic Orthodox Christian theology. I mean, feminism rises when Orthodox Christian theology and belief decreases. And I mean, if you just look at the churches in general, those who are more traditional and Orthodox aren't the ones with women priests or vicars, and those that are more sort of Orthodox don't. So I mean, that's one obvious thing to point out there. So Tim, any final comments?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm somewhat to the extent I can be, especially I think in analysis. I think having a fairly, to the extent you can, have a fairly emotional viewpoint is a relevant thing to do. So the question of those questions like, feminism or anti-slavery, like in some ways I don't personally care to the extent that I can be either way personally care. But I do think a proper intellectual heritage of where the movements come from is relevant. Actually, the NHS, the cult of the NHS. I mean, this is something that Woodrow Wilson sort of brought in with his food czars in World War I managing the railroads, and that's how he got prohibition in the United States. The demon rum, so to speak. So yeah, the fact that the NHS is banning all sorts of things is to me right out of the page book, right out of the page. And again, it is true that it's democratic in name, but probably not democratic. But then again, all power in a way is right wing, as our mutual correspondent Keith Preston would argue. All power, anyone in power, Stalin, Mussolini, FDR, anyone in power if power always governs right wing. But and that's something that Carl Schmitt would say too. Power always governs in right wing ways, but it has its significance is you go back to Rome. It's not like the Romans never had any intent. Maybe later on for pragmatic reasons, but they never really had intent to democratize the people they were going after. They were more like just general conquerors. But in the United States, fairly early on in the reconquering of Germany after World War II, had this sort of basically manifest destiny plan of turning Germany into an American colony, so to speak. I mean, that's a very, and they succeeded fairly well. I mean, they succeed for better or for worse. Again, cultural agnosticism, to the extent I can have cultural agnosticism. And actually, I'd argue that we've over time have colonized Britain to a large extent as well, and culturally, although you colonized in a way that's a cross-pollination more so. But I would argue in general that the cult of NHS is that doesn't surprise me. It would surprise someone who's not familiar with Rothbard or that Italian thinker or James Burnham, but I think it's within par. But great discussions with and thanks for doing it.
I would like to thank everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed this, please share it with your friends and family. And subscribe to us on YouTube, on Podbean, on any other places. The more subscriptions we get, the higher we get in the rankings, and more people can hear the show. And if you'd like to contact the show with ideas, comments, or criticisms, please contact us at mindcrimelibертyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibертyshow@gmail.com.